So if you are from a certain generation, my generation, then there's a song that indelibly lives in your spirit. If you know it, feel free to sing along. Sometimes I dream that he is me. You've got to see that's how I dream to be. Boom, 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 boom. I dream I move. I dream I groove like Mike. If I could be like Mike. Sound familiar? Anybody know that song? I heard very few people singing along with me. Yes, be like Mike. I loved Michael Jordan growing up. In fact, I idolized the man. I spent hours upon hours emulating him on my basketball court in my front driveway. I would practice his dunk contest slams by using a trampoline. I would copy his fadeaway jumper in the corner. I would count down to 0 in order to emulate his buzzer-beating last-second shots. And I would do all of this with my tongue out, just like Mike. Be like Mike. The only problem was, and I know this is going to come as a shocker to some of you, I was not Michael Jordan. So this caused a problem. When we would play pickup games in my driveway, anytime I tried to emulate Michael Jordan, I would turn the ball over, I would miss a shot, or I would indelibly make a fool of myself. I wasn't Michael Jordan. I had my own game, which was more along the lines of a Shaquille O'Neal, I would say. Not that talented, but my game was more like Shaq than MJ's. I had my own gifts, my own style, which was unique to me, but it was not Michael Jordan, and I wanted to be like Mike. Oftentimes, when we look at the world around us, we want to be someone that we are not. We try to emulate people who we are not. We craft our world in the image of others rather than our own gifts. See, the Israelites in our story today, the Israelites were a small tribe in the ancient Mediterranean. They'd made it to the promised land and had settled in, and they were trying and starting and beginning to create a permanent society there. They were led by a system of judges and prophets. God had taken care of God's people. But as they'd set out to settle down, they were in constant threat by the nations around them. Settling down in the ancient Mediterranean had also not just put them in constant threat, but exposed them to other cultures, other kings, and other forms of government. God had rescued them from slavery in Egypt, had brought them into the promised land, and helped them defeat the Philistines just before this story. But the people wanted something different. They wanted a king just like the other nations around them. They were looking around and they were crafting their world in the image of others. And so they went to God's prophet, Samuel, the man who had served God well his whole life, from the time he was born. If you read the beginning of Samuel, it's a very beautiful story of Samuel's mom praying for a child and making a promise to God that if she is gifted with a child, that she will present him to God and give him to God. And that's exactly what she does. She miraculously gets pregnant and gives Samuel to the prophet Eli to raise him. And that's the story that actually inspires Mary in the Magnificat. Inspires her to have the bravery and the strength with Jesus. And so they go to Samuel. The people go to Samuel. And they ask him to appoint a king to govern them, just like the other nations. And so with a sweaty brow and with trepidation, I'm sure, Samuel brings this request to the Lord. And God sees this request and hears this request. And God sees it as a rejection. God says, from the day I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you, God said to Samuel. And God gave Samuel words to show the people all that they would be giving up if they had a king. All the sacrifices that they would have to make materially, they would have to make with their children, make with themselves. But still, besides all of this, based on the image of the nations around them, they were determined to have a king. It was a rejection of Samuel's prophetic leadership and another rejection of God. They have rejected me, God said. They have rejected me. Think about that. They have rejected me. Think about how painful rejection is in your own life. And here is God, who's done so much for the people of Israel. God's own children rejecting what God has given them. God's very presence. In how many ways have we crafted our own world in our own image? In how many ways have we rejected God in our own lives? We pursue careers that we don't want necessarily, but we do because it makes our parents happy or it gives us a certain status in the world. We give up hobbies or special interests because they are seen as nerdy or weird or are embarrassing for some other reason. We create social images on social media that create a false image of our lives so that we will be respected and liked by others around us. Like the Israelites, we try to take full control of our lives rather than allowing God to live through us. We craft our world in the image of others around us, and in the process, we reject God. But see, when somebody makes a statement like, they are rejecting me, when somebody makes a statement like this, oftentimes there's another statement being made underneath it. Yes, God is saying that they are rejecting God's own leadership, but God is saying something else too. And when I hear God say this, I think of this. And I think in God's words, we can hear this. We can hear this unspoken statement of God. And God is saying to the people, do you know how special you are? Do you know how special you are? Think of all the gifts God has given them. Think about just the story of the wilderness. God heard the cries of the people of Israel, and God felt with the people of Israel and identified with the people of Israel and brought them out of Egypt. God saved the people of Israel from Pharaoh, through the Red Sea and into the wilderness. And when they arrived in the wilderness, God didn't let them starve. God sent a supply of food to last them forever. And then God led them into the land of milk and honey, the promised land. Do you know how special you are? I feel like God is saying to the people of Israel. Just before this, the Philistines stole the Ark of the Covenant, defeated the people of Israel, and took the Ark of the Covenant. And God, through God's power, led the Philistines to give the Ark of the Covenant back. Do you know how special you are? Do you know how special you are? As an individual, do you know how special you are? Your uniquenesses, your idiosyncrasies, your differences, these aren't things to be ashamed of. These aren't things to want to change. These are things that are blessings because they allow you to live into who God has created you to be. If we are always trying to craft our world in the image of others, then this world is never going to have as much as it possibly can. Because if everyone is trying to do the same thing, we don't get the diversity that difference brings to this world. Lots of people try to change body image, to change the way they dress, to change the way they live, to change what their talents are, not because they don't enjoy those things, the ways that they find happiness, but because they want to fit into the society in which they live. Do you know how special you are? Do you know what you give up? What you give over when you try to be something you're not? But here's the good news. No matter how many times you reject God, no matter how many times you try to live in the image of others, no matter how many times you try to step away from God, God is not going to leave you. Look what happens after this. The people want a king. God says, you shouldn't want a king. Allow me to continue to lead you. But the people say, no, we want a king. And God has that stab in the heart of the rejection of God's own people. But God doesn't leave the people of Israel. God doesn't say, okay, you can have a king. See you later. I'm out. God doesn't do that. God goes and finds Saul, lifts Saul up, which leads eventually to King David, the great king of Israel. This isn't what God had in mind for God's people. But if they're going to reject him, he's at least going to work with them and try to make the best of the possibility. And God does exactly that. God never leaves or betrays us. God never allows us to do things on our own. God is always with us, working to help us. God is always here, waiting for our return. God is going to allow us to fail, but God is not going to exit from our presence. I go back to this, one of my favorite descriptions of us and God. We sang a hymn by her last week, Julian of Norwich, where she talks about the very core of our life being knitted into the presence of God. So there's God and there's us. And it's almost like you're taking a piece of knitting, like crochet, and you're weaving the two together. God is not going to leave us, even though we try to reject God's presence in our lives. But do you know how special you are? What if you took time to bask in God's presence on a daily basis? What if you took time to try to live the love ethic of Jesus day in and day out? What if you took time to work for this relationship that is always present in our lives? Imagine what would happen if we tried to live in our gifts that God has blessed us with. What somebody else might see as unique or different or weird. What if we embrace that, knowing that God had given us those things for us to be great? And when I say great, I mean great because we are living to be what God has created us to be. Don't craft the world in the image of others. Craft the world in the knowledge of how special you are because you were born, formed, and given breath by God. Amen.